Hi, I'm Christopher Pine, and I'm the chairman of Vision 2020. I follow in the footsteps of Barry Jones, and today is the Barry Jones Vision Oration. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the elders past, present, and emerging from all of the places where people are watching this oration today. And I'd particularly like to welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us. Can I also, right from the start, acknowledge our sponsors without whom this event wouldn't have been able to occur. The Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Ophthalmologists, the Fred Hollows Foundation, Optometry Australia, and Novartis. Barry Jones was the chairman of Vision 2020 for 12 years and has spent a lifetime serving others. Fortunately for us, he has a particular interest in eye health and now is a patron of Vision 2020, along with our other patron, former Senator Amanda Vanstone. Our speaker today is Professor Kristopher Rallah-Baker, the first Indigenous Australian ophthalmologist. It's an amazing achievement. Chris is also a proud Yuggera and Biri-Gubba man. He's one of the founding members of the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association. He's on the board of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, a service that my own father worked for in the 1950s, and because of his work with Indigenous Australians, caused him to decide to become an ophthalmologist. So he follows in the footsteps of my dad, and it's a very exciting moment for me to have him as our guest speaker at this oration today. He's also an advisor to the Fred Hollows Foundation and is the chair of the Vision 2020 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Committee. He's very excited about sharing his knowledge and experiences with us here at Vision 2020, but we're particularly excited and privileged to have him deliver the second Barry Jones Vision Oration. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kristopher Rallah-Baker, the first Australian Indigenous ophthalmologist.
I'd like to begin by saying many thanks to Vision 2020 Australia for the opportunity to deliver the Barry Jones Vision Oration this year in 2021. It's obviously an unusual circumstance having to pre-record a video online like this, and I guess it's the way of the world at the moment, and hopefully it won't last for too much longer. My name is Kristopher Rallah-Baker, and I'm the first recognised Indigenous ophthalmologist in Australia. My background on my mother's side is Yuggera and Biri-Gubba, so I have connections to the Brisbane Basin as well as North Queensland peoples. And on my father's side is Wiradjuri, which is the Riverina area in New South Wales. I was born in the ACT, in fact, in the old Royal Canberra Hospital, and extensively grew up in Brisbane, in Queensland. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we all sit today, and specifically acknowledge the land on which I sit today, which is the Yuggera Northern neighbour, the Gubbi people. The great privilege of being in my rooms, which are situated in Noosa on the Sunshine Coast. So, as I said, I was born in Canberra, and at the young age of 4, moved to Brisbane with my parents and my brother to formalise my schooling, most of my primary school and my secondary school. And growing up as a young Aboriginal boy in what was the early 80s onwards through to the 90s was an interesting experience, and an experience that was very different, I think, to the experiences of young Indigenous children, certainly in metropolitan areas today. We arrived up in Brisbane in the days of the Bjelke-Petersen era and saw the tail end of that era. And those experiences helped shape my life and the direction of my life. So I essentially completed my school in Queensland. I then went down to the University of Newcastle and completed my medicine there, and then returned to Queensland. I did my general medical training and then further training with the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Ophthalmologists, with whom I have my fellowship. There are a number of issues that I'd like to speak on today in relation to not only the context of Indigenous eye health, but the wider context of workforce issues and creating opportunities for young Indigenous kids, like I was once, to reach their full potential and contribute not only to our own communities, but the Australian community in a wider context. So we're all aware of the current state of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander eye health in the country. And I guess the good news is that of the closing the gap targets, the eye health target actually is being achieved. We haven't yet reached parity, but we have reduced the rate of disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country of 10 times the rate of preventable blindness to 3 times the rate of preventable blindness, which is a significant achievement. We're not there yet, but I always like to look at the achievements that have been made and reflect on those and reflect on the enormous distance that we've come before we talk about where we need to go. So a way that I like to look at life and a way that I like to look at achievement is, well, how far have we come? And then use that as a positive boost to then forward into improving the situation, whatever it might be. So we're now at 3 times the rate of preventable blindness of non-Indigenous Australians. And the 4 areas of preventable blindness, the 4 main areas of preventable blindness for Indigenous people are trachoma, which does still exist in this country, but hopefully will be eradicated in the not too distant future. Refractive error, which is largely dealt with spectacles and outreach optometry in rural remote areas and metro optometry in metropolitan areas. The great scourge of diabetes, which of course doesn't just affect the eyes, and cataracts, which of course are treated with surgery. The approach to Indigenous eye care in this country has evolved with time, as many other things have evolved. And what I would like to see looking forwards, and I think which has become an increasing hallmark of Indigenous eye health in this country, is the recognition of self-determination and the recognition that Indigenous peoples are a major part of the solution of Indigenous eye health. And I say that not to undermine the enormous efforts of non-Indigenous ophthalmologists and optometrists who have worked tirelessly in the past, and as well as the Indigenous health workers who have worked very, very closely with those people. But I say it because we're entering into a new era. We're entering into an era where we can work in true collaboration with Indigenous and non-Indigenous professionals across all levels of eye health care. I, of course, represent the ophthalmology side, and I'm proud to say that as of next year, we will have one Aboriginal trainee and 1 Torres Strait Islander trainee in the college, and they'll be the first Indigenous trainees since I entered the college in 2009. So in the not too distant future, we will have more than just 1 Indigenous ophthalmologist in this country, which is extremely exciting. But also it's about increasing the numbers of Indigenous optometrists. And I work very, very closely with one of the universities in Brisbane on a project to do that, as well as increasing the number of healthcare workers and nurses and associated workforce to improve the number of Indigenous people in the eye health sector. I was for 2 years and finishing in October last year, the president of the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association. And in that capacity, I was involved with workforce, not only in ophthalmology, but across all areas of Indigenous workforce. And I was very pleased today to learn that there's been a further strengthening in the work towards building the Indigenous workforce in the eye health field specifically, with the signing of an MOU between the Royal Australian Royal Australian New Zealand College of Ophthalmologists and the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association. So that's a very exciting development to help improve the number of ophthalmologists in the country. But by building the workforce, we build the capacity within Indigenous Australia to realise true self-determination. And self-determination being the ability of peoples to determine their own futures, but working in partnership with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. And that's really the only way that this can happen. The implications of that are not just that we will improve the vision of First Nations people in this country. The implications are much, much wider. The fundamental principle of self-determination should really apply to all areas of Indigenous embedment and Indigenous engagement. And in the eye health arena, by improving the vision of people and improving the vision of communities, it not only has the direct impact of allowing those individuals to get about their day-to-day lives, and as we know, reducing the risk of comorbidities, like hip fractures and falls in the context of cataract surgery. But also, probably more importantly, there's an impact on the community itself and the ability to pass on and transmit ancient cultures. An example of that situation was when I was working the top end as the outreach fellow in 2014. I spent 6 months across the top end of Northern Territory. And we'd done cataract surgery on an elderly gentleman, and he was very, very excited to have his vision back. But he made the comment that not only did he have his vision back, that he was then able to take his grandchildren out into the bush and teach them culture and maintain that connection, that deep, endearing connection with country and with the eons of history that came before him. And that was the most important factor for him. So by delivering improved eye health and by achieving the gap closure and by achieving parity with non-Indigenous Australia preventable blindness, we actually not only build the medical capacity and the visual capacity of these people, but we actually strengthen the entire community. We actually strengthen the fabric of the community. And the wider effects of that are that the community then, so the confidence in the community builds the confidence in the communities to be able to work towards wider issues and addressing issues of injustice and poverty are then better supported. So the point of making is we have a much, much wider impact than just allowing people and creating better vision for people in those areas. And that includes rural, remote, as well as metropolitan areas. We have a number of people in metropolitan areas who have equally poor healthcare as those in rural or remote areas. And for a variety of reasons, either they've moved in from rural or remote areas, or that they have the same cautions around mainstream healthcare that effectively prevent them from accessing services that they would otherwise access, which again ties into this issue of workforce, again ties into the issue of overall self-determination, and underlying all of that in the tertiary sector is the principle of cultural safety and the ability to create workplaces and workspaces and health spaces that are non-judgmental, in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are able to enter and access to have their healthcare appropriately delivered to them. In terms of my insights as an Aboriginal person working within eye healthcare, it's quite a personal thing to be. Well, it has quite a personal impact to be, the first in a field, and particularly the first in a field that can have such wide impacts on people and communities as what eye care can. And I mentioned earlier in today about being that little black kid growing up in Holland Park in Brisbane, and achieving what I've achieved, I still have to sit down at times and think and reflect on how far I've come and how far my family has brought me. I do stand on the shoulders of giants who came before me. It was my great-grandmother on my mother's side, who was a Warrangal woman from North Queensland, who was brought down from Bowen by force at the age of 10 and then processed through both Cherbourg and Mayoral missions on Stradbroke Island. And on her third application for marriage, was allowed to marry my great-grandfather, who, as it turned out, was an Aboriginal man who wasn't subject to the Act. And that moment in time when the mission head agreed to allowing her to marry an Aboriginal man who wasn't under the Act at that time, which controlled Aboriginal people's lives in Queensland, that changed the entire destiny of my family, because it allowed my great-grandmother to have children and keep those children without them being taken away. It allowed my grandmother to grow up with her brothers. It allowed her then to marry a man of her choice and then keep her children. And it was through the efforts of my father and my mother that I had the great privilege of attending a private boys' school in Queensland, and that then set the platform for me to go through medicine, achieve in medicine, and now become the ophthalmologist and man who I am. And there are many, many stories in Indigenous Australia similar to that. I'm not unique in any way of, a person having an incredible family, as well as the opportunity made to me, and then be able to achieve with that. But it really comes back to what I was saying earlier about giving people the confidence to achieve, giving people the ability to hope and dream, and ultimately building that workforce, building the confidence in the community, and building the confidence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to yet again stand on our own feet and be involved in the decision-making processes and walk as equals with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. That's what I see as the bright future. And I think we have a very, very bright future as a country, working together and moving forwards. And there are enormous strengths in doing that. There are strengths in that diversity, and there is enormous pride that we can all hold in achieving as a country and in sharing the ancient wisdom and knowledge that Indigenous people bring, as well as sharing the scientific endeavours of Western society. So I guess, my insights, as I said, as an Aboriginal person, are that I think we have a very, very positive future, but I think working together is the key to that. Self-determination has to underlie all of that. Issues of cultural safety within all institutions needs to be improved and really held in the high esteem that it should. And in the next 50 years, I think we will achieve enormous things. And, 50 years to Aboriginal communities really isn't very long. We've been here for a lot longer than that. And as Indigenous First Nations people, it's always about the long game. It's not about the next 3-year election cycle or the next 10 years or 20 years. It's about where we're going to be, where our grandchildren are going to be, where our great-grandchildren are going to be. And I think we have a very bright and positive future. So, look, it is a great privilege to be able to deliver the Barry Jones Vision Oration today. And I again thank Vision 2020 for the opportunity to speak about this. As I've touched on, workforce is key to improving the health status of Indigenous people and closing that gap. But we have come a long, long way. There are many, many positive things that are happening in the sector, and they're occurring at an accelerating speed. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your audience. And I look forward to continuing to work within the sector, continuing to work with my Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues, and improving a future for all Australians together.
I'm delighted to have an opportunity to respond to tonight's eponymous oration, and delighted that it should be prehumus rather than posthumous. The inaugural lecture was given by the Australian of the Year 2020, Professor James Mukey from Adelaide, and it was a statement of great significance. And tonight, what we've heard has also been a statement of great significance by somebody who's playing a historic role as the first Indigenous professor of eye health in Australia. And that's something to be greatly proud of, and we're very excited and honoured that he should have been prepared to deliver the lecture. I've had a very long involvement in Aboriginal affairs. From 1968, I worked with the great H.C. Nugget Coombs when he was the chairman of both the Council for Aboriginal Affairs and the Australian Council for the Arts, as it was then called. And through him, I became to know many Indigenous leaders. And then when the Whitlam government was in, I was particularly close to Gordon Bryant, who was Gough Whitlam's Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and a man of very passionate involvement. I also had a lot to do with the extraordinary and rather eccentric William Charles Wentworth IV, person who, despite his historic background as an epitome of the settler view of Australian society, in fact had a passionate commitment, well ahead of his time on his side of politics, to Indigenous issues. And when I was in the Victorian Parliament a long, long time ago, almost half a century ago, I was the Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. And I took my responsibilities very seriously, and I visited many significant sites and had many friends in the Aboriginal community. And later on, when I was in the Commonwealth Parliament, I was there after the Mabo judgment, when you had the legislation coming through to entrench native title, or at least the beginning of it. And my wife, Rachel Faggett, who worked for many years at the Institute of Koori Education at Deakin University. So she's been a powerful advocate and a powerful supporter where Indigenous issues are concerned. In 2002, I was persuaded to join the board of Vision 2020 by my great friend, or our great friend, Hugh Taylor, who was then the Dean of Ophthalmology at Melbourne University, but later became had the Harold Mitchell Chair for Indigenous Eye Health, the first such chair in Australia. Now, Hugh had an international reputation for his work into his research into river blindness, into trachoma, and the role of ultraviolet exposure and the development of cataracts. And when he received his AC in 2011, the citation emphasises his contribution to Indigenous eye health. I chaired Vision 2020 Australia for 12 years, from 2002 to 14. And undoubtedly, the high point was when Hugh and I persuaded Kevin Rudd to kick in $58 million for a campaign for the elimination of trachoma. And Vision 2020 now has more than 20 years of achievement. It was soon recognised as the peak body for eye health and preventing avoidable blindness, cooperating with and coordinating advocacy with more than 40 specialist groups who had their own priorities: glaucoma, guide dogs, macular degeneration, the Fred Hollows Foundation, and so on. And the organisation has rightly gained international recognition for its skilled advocacy for eye health. And with a rapidly expanding population, which is ageing, maintaining high levels of eye health at comparatively low cost can assist older people to maintain independent living, prevent accidents, keep them out of institutions. And Vision 2020 has been outstanding in its advocacy of the right to sight for Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders by tackling trachoma, diabetes, assuring access to clean water, and ensuring that skilled help is available. Tonight's speaker, Associate Professor Kristopher Rallah-Baker, a Yuggera and Biri-Gubba man, has had a remarkable achievement working through Queensland. It's very much to my regret that I haven't met him, and I hope at some early opportunity I will have that opportunity. But when you think of what he's achieved, it is quite extraordinary. He's, among other things, he's been the chair of the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association. As you can see, he's a very persuasive advocate, a person of great capacity, a person of great integrity. We need leaders like this at a time when, if I could avoid being political, leadership seems to be, I think, in short supply, and courage too. I think our speaker tonight has both these qualities, and I congratulate Vision 2020 in organising this lecture to celebrate what small contribution I've made to Vision 2020. They've chosen admirably in the speaker tonight.